Hello everyone. In this video I would like to discuss others of Marvell's poems besides To His Coy Mistress, in particular the Bermudas, the Garden, and the Mower poems, enigmatic as these are. The first of these, Bermudas, seems to be a relatively straightforward poem, written perhaps, written on the occasion, perhaps not immediately upon the discovery of the Bermudas, but the Bermudas discovered during Marvell's lifetime and settled by English colonists. And the poem is a sort of tribute. It's primarily a praise of God for the gift of the Bermuda Islands, which English nonconformists, that is, dissenting in religion, these are dissenters from the older traditional forms of the Anglican Church, more or less the kind of people that the Pilgrims were, who settled the Massachusetts Bay Colony, something analogous to that. And so they come to the Bermudas, which are going to be for them a new kind of paradise, a new kind of heaven on earth, and generally speaking, the poem sets that tone. One might remark that there's a hint of structural complexity in that it is a framed poem. The first 4 lines are a frame, and the last 4 lines constitute the rest of that frame. Here you have a narrator telling us that a boat is being rowed along the ocean, and the boat is carrying settlers to the Bermudas, and then the main portion of the poem, by far the largest number of verses, is a hymn that is sung by these pilgrims in praise to God at the prospect of settling this new world. Where the remote Bermudas rise, and I should also mention too that this is basically an octosyllabic couplets, the same kind of meter that, or I should say the same meter that Marvell uses into his Coy Mistress. Where the remote Bermudas ride in the ocean's bosom unespied, from a small boat that rode along the listening winds received this song. And then begins the song itself, or the hymn of praise. What should we do but sing his praise that led us through the watery maze unto an isle so long unknown, and yet far kinder than our own? Kinder in 2 senses, I think. It's going to be kinder to the religious dissenters. It doesn't have an established religion that can persecute them because the islands are uninhabited, and kinder in terms of climate. England is an island off the northwestern coast of Europe, and therefore in certain parts of England things can get pretty cold, but Bermuda is in a much warmer climate farther south in the Atlantic Ocean. Here, where he, the huge sea monsters, wrecks that lifts his deep upon the backs, so God is keeping them safe in their transit from terrible sea monsters. He lands us on the grassy stage, safe from the storms and prelates' raid. So they've managed to come through without mishap, landing on the shore here, and they don't have to worry about storms now, and they don't have to worry about prelates, that is, bishops in the Church of England who are going to persecute them. He gave us this eternal spring which here enamels everything. So a kind of Edenic image, the notion that Adam and Eve lived in this garden paradise before the passage of time had any real significance, because the passage of time is primarily significant to those who are going to die. Since any increment of time, let's say the amount of time that it takes you to watch this video, will bring you that amount of time closer to your death. But Adam and Eve before the fall didn't have to worry about that. They could have watched as many of these videos as they liked, as often as they liked, and they would have been no closer to their death after doing so than they were before they began, because they were not under the sentence of death, and their lives would have gone on eternally. So here, this is a kind of Eden found again, and I might say that this notion of English colonists coming to the New World, even if it's not the North American mainland, but in the direction of the New World and founding these new societies, very often think of themselves as a new kind of Eden, as a beginning again. This is a trope, a very popular trope in early American literature, up through literature of the 19th century, and perhaps in some cases even later. And so we find that here, that they have discovered a new kind of Eden where they can where mankind can begin again. Which here enamels everything and sends the fowls to us in care on daily visits through the air. So a bit unclear here whether the fowls are going to be able to be hunted and used for food, or whether they're just enjoying the visitation of these birds on their migrations. But at any rate, birds often associated, going all the way back to the classical world, birds often associated with the gods, because birds are suspended in the air above heaven where the gods dwell and earth where we dwell, so they're very often messengers. I don't mean to say that Marvell is suggesting all of that here, but perhaps there are hints of that in the background. He hangs and shades the orange bright like golden lamps in a green night. That rhythm, by the way, in the second line there, like golden lamps in a green night in line 18, is a rhythm he's going to use in a most stunning line in his poem, The Garden. But here what he's talking about is the tropical climate that allows oranges or grapefruits to grow here against the dark green foliage. And does in the pomegranates close jewels more rich than Ormuz shows, a famous Near Eastern marketplace for jewels in the Straits of Hormuz. We still hear about the Straits of Hormuz from time to time there at the head of the Persian Gulf, because it's such a flashpoint of international concern. He makes the figs our mouths to meet and throws the melons at our feet, but apples, that is pineapples, plants of such a price, no tree could ever bear them twice. So all of this attention to fruit, again suggestive of the Garden of Eden. It's a little odd, I might say, in the extravagance of the imagery here associated with fruit. We don't get this kind of extravagance, certainly in the biblical narrative. We hardly get this kind of extravagance in the main English work of literature devoted to life in the Garden of Eden, that is Milton's Paradise Lost, also a work of the 17th century. There seems a kind of richness and exoticism in these images of Marvell, which may mean nothing. They may also, again, the poem is a bit enigmatic. Are these just images of fruit and therefore call forth the gratitude of those singing this hymn, and that's it? So that their praise is a bit extravagant, or is Marvell trying to hint at something else, that this is Edenic, and that with so much attention to the fruit, he's hinting that there is every possibility of a fall here? It's very difficult to say, and in fact, I would say there's very little suggestion of the latter interpretation, except that Marvell does seem to devote a great deal of loving attention to these kind of exotic fruits. On the other hand, he may well have done anyway, since they're settled, since the subject matter lends itself to that, since these settlers are coming to a rather exotic part of the world, compared in particular with the climate you get in England. And then he moves on to other natural wonders and benefits that are produced in the Bermudas. With cedars chosen by his hand from Lebanon, he stores his land. So the cedar of Lebanon, I don't know if in particular the cedar of Lebanon was native to the Bermudas. I find that a bit hard to believe, but perhaps it's just barely possible. But the cedar of Lebanon, a particularly prestigious type of wood that features prominently, for instance, in the book of 1 Kings, when we get the detailed description of Solomon's temple in all of its dimensions and its various materials of construction. The cedars of Lebanon are a particular prestigious form of material used by Solomon and Hiram, who was a king apparently and craftsman and well-known craftsman from Lebanon who came to help out the construction of that temple. But Cedars of Lebanon, he stores the land and makes the hollow seas that roar proclaim the ambergris on shore. So ambergris is a kind of material that is produced, I believe, by whales, and it's not exactly precious, but maybe something like semi-precious that washes up on shore here and can be taken for the collecting. Again, it's to the English mind, it would be an exotic substance and a beautiful substance. The gospel's pearl upon our coast, he cast, of which we rather boast, the gospel's pearl upon our coast. So apparently rich in pearls there on the sands of the Bermuda shores. And the reference to the gospel is entirely appropriate, since these are Christians who are coming to settle Bermuda. There's the pearl of great price that Christ talks about in the Gospels, and also one of the parables in which the kingdom of heaven in the Gospels is described as being like a pearl of great price, which when a person finds this pearl, sells absolutely everything so as to be able to afford this particular pearl. And in these rocks for us did frame a temple where to sound his name. So apparently a cavern that can be used as a kind of temple until they can erect one themselves. Oh, let our voice his praise exalt till it arrives at heaven's vault, which thence perhaps rebounding may echo beyond the Mexic Bay. So their praise, they hope, will ascend and be acceptable to heaven, and then rebound from heaven and spread far and wide, even beyond the Gulf of Mexico. Thus sung they in the English boat, and holy and a cheerful note, and all the way to guide their chime with falling oars they kept the time. So again, if one takes it for simply what it says on the surface, it's a perfectly fine poem, adroitly handled in terms of its meter and structure, and relatively straightforward hymn of praise to God for all of the bounty that he has blessed them with as they've come to this new land of the Bermudas. On the other hand, some of the images seem perhaps a bit extravagant simply for a poem that says only that. But if Marvell does have something else in mind, it's a bit difficult to know exactly what it is, unless, as I suggested a few moments ago, it is a hint or an indication that just as the fruit in the Garden of Eden was good to look upon, and just as the consumption of that fruit produced all sorts of disastrous consequences for mankind, maybe there's a hint here in this loving attention to the physical pleasures that are afforded by the Bermudas, and in particular the fruits that are there for their consumption, that maybe there's something else going on. But be that as it may, we may move then to the mower poems. I'd like to begin by looking at the mower to the glow. Well, I suppose, yes, begin by looking at the mower to the glowworms and move on to the mower's song, and then maybe end up with the mower against gardens. And then I would like to contrast the latter of those poems, the mower against gardens, with his poem, The Garden. So the mower to glowworms, again, relatively straightforward. It is a mower who is seeing the glowworms. Think of the glowworms which exist in England. Think of them as essentially like our fireflies or our lightning bugs. These are bioluminescent creatures which are detected in the evening, and they're particularly beautiful. And for most of the poem, the mower who is saying this poem is praising their beauty. Ye living lamps, by whose dear light the nightingale does sit so late, and studying all the summer's night her matchless songs does meditate. So again, a very nice word of praise to the glowworms. that they provide the light that allows the nightingale. Pardon me. By the way, the nightingale has proverbially the most beautiful of all songs, and sings it in the evening. So it allows the nightingale to stay up and burn the midnight oil, as it were, by the light of these glowworms in order to produce these magnificent songs. Ye country comets that portend no war nor prince's funeral, shining unto no higher end than to presage the grasses fall. So again, drawing on the old idea, you get this a lot in Shakespeare, for instance, and you get it in Richard II or Julius Caesar, or even Macbeth, this idea that these signs and wonders, it's certainly a biblical idea, that signs and wonders that we see in the heavens usually portend that something bad is going to happen. As the old Chinese proverb says, may you live in interesting times. That when you see these interesting phenomena, they usually portend something unsettling. So here, the country comets, these lights that you see flitting about you, not anything terribly portentous, just something as plain and ordinary as the fact that the grass is going to be cut, not the fall of princes or kingdoms or nations, but that the grass is going to fall maybe the next day or the following day when the mower gets out there and cuts it. Ye glowworms whose officious flame to wandering mowers shows the way. So the glowworms light the way to people who are walking in the evening, that in the night have lost their aim and after foolish fires do stray. So the will-o'-the-wisp, these glowing lights that come from marshes or fens, that proverbially when people see them they mistake it for the lights of their home or lights of a village, and so they go in that direction and end up being mired in the bog. The glowworms counteract that by showing the true way home. So far so good. The first three stanzas of the poem talk about how the glowworms essentially are nice to look at and essentially offer good services to the folks that happen to see them, with perhaps, again, I don't know how much Marvell wants the reader to emphasize this, perhaps at the end of the second stanza, a bit of unpleasantness, talking about the grasses fall. On the other hand, I'm not entirely sure that's so. It seems to me that in this context, the fall of the grass is just simply an ordinary event that occurs on a regular basis during the summertime in the countryside. Your courteous lights in vain you waste, since Juliana here is come, for she my mind hath so displaced that I shall never find my home. So that fourth stanza then considerably darker. So the glowworms are there to produce light to help the speaker of the poem perhaps find his way home, but it doesn't make any difference because he has suffered so much harm from Juliana that his mind has now become discomposed and he's never going to be happy again and never be able to find his way home. And again, it's difficult to know how to take this poem. That fourth stanza certainly is darker than the others. On the other hand, how seriously are we to take that fourth stanza? It is true that sometimes a lover can do, the beloved can do serious damage to a lover. On the other hand, it's also the case that a beloved will cause the lover some amount of pain here and there. It happens on a daily basis in middle school. Is that a serious situation? Of course, any lover who's going through it and feels rejected by the beloved will feel as if he's in the middle of a tragedy, when in fact very often he's not. It's just the vagaries of young puppy love. Is that what we're dealing with here, or are we dealing with a genuine tragedy of serious import? It's difficult to know. We don't get enough information. Now, we may get more information if we read this poem in light of the mower's song. The fact that the mower is the speaker of both poems indicates that perhaps we might want to do that. If so, then we get a little more sense that whether or not it is objectively true that Juliana has seriously harmed, seriously damaged in an emotional way, the mower, or whether the mower is building up something in his mind that wasn't as serious, is difficult to say, because the poems don't disclose precisely what happened. What the poems disclose is the speaker's reaction to the fact that Juliana has made him unhappy. Some people are more sensitive than others. Some people take as Olivia says in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, some people take for cannonballs what really are meant as little pellet shots. It's just hard to know. It's very difficult to know here. But at any rate, what we get in the mower's song is the fact that primarily the point of the poem is that the mower felt a great fellowship with the grass until Juliana hurt him in some way, and the grass continued to grow and kept on blooming, thereby showing that it was not terribly sympathetic to the mower, who wasn't flourishing as a result of Juliana's slight. And so now the mower is angry and is going to, in a kind of retaliation or revenge, is going to cut down the grass, which refused to express sufficient solidarity with him or sufficient sympathy with him. Let's put it that way. My mind was once the true survey of all these meadows fresh and gay, and in the greenness of the grass did see its hopes as in a glass that is a mirror. All right, so he was perfectly happy out there in the fields, and the fields in their greenery and their continual growth and peace mirrored his mind completely, which once upon a time was placid and happy. But Juliana came, and she, what I do to the grass does to my thoughts and me. So just as he cuts down the grass, Juliana has done to him. Again, it is sometimes the case that a beloved can betray a lover in a serious way and do serious damage, cause serious dementia, or cause suicide, for instance. Or it's sometimes the case that the lover is extraordinarily sensitive and takes great offense at something that really shouldn't be construed as a tragedy. We simply don't know which of these categories, or maybe something in between, the event that this poem alludes to falls into. But these, while I with sorrow pine, grew more luxuriant still and fine, that not one blade of grass you spied, but had a flower on either side. So something happened to the speaker. He suffered something at Julia's hands, and instead of continuing to be a mirror of his mind, the field of grass grew and continued to flourish, while the speaker was feeling sorrow and pain. When Juliana came, and she, what I do to the grass does to my thoughts and me. Right? Unthankful meadows, could you sow a fellowship so true forego, and in your gaudy May games meet, while I lay trodden under feet? Right? You continue to grow and flourish, literally flourish, that is flower, while I feeling so miserable and literally downtrodden. Well, I shouldn't say literally, but emotionally downtrodden by Juliana here. But what you in compassion ought, compassion, literally, the word means to suffer with. Patior in Latin means to lie open and exposed, and therefore to suffer. In compassion, the grass ought to suffer what their friend is suffering in his mind, but what in compassion you ought shall now by my revenge be wrought. So since the grass ought to fall and express its sorrow at his pain, but it doesn't because it's not human and not animate, but anyway, since it doesn't, the mower is going to come along and cut down the grass. And flowers and grass and I and all will in one common ruin fall. For Juliana comes, and she, what I do to the grass does to my thoughts and me. And thus ye meadows which have been companions of my thoughts more green, perhaps before experience. Experience often means pain and suffering, which makes us wiser. So perhaps green in that sense, more innocent and less experienced. Now he is less green, and he's going to ensure that the grass is less green, because he's going to cut it down. with which I shall adorn my tomb, for Juliana comes and she, what I do to the grass does to my thoughts and me. So certainly the speaker is feeling that what has happened between Juliana and him is a tragedy, and a tragedy that is going to lead to his death, and therefore out of sympathy he is going to ensure that the grass dies as well. But how seriously we should take this is difficult to say, because we don't know enough. What we have here is a limited psychological perspective. We have only the speaker's response to some kind of slight, whether conscious or unconscious, whether major or minor, on Juliana's part. And so, yes. And perhaps that's the best way to read this poem and the poem on glowworms, is that it is a just picture of a mind. Whether or not that mind is evaluating the circumstances accurately is a different question. And maybe that's the best way to read these poems, as just that, a depiction not so much of a relationship, but a depiction of the mind of a person responding to something that has happened in the relationship. If so, it still raises the question why Marvell would write such a thing. It's certainly very different than anything else we have read so far in 17th century poetry, and maybe it shows that Marvell is ahead of his time. If we are correct in reading these poems, if we're wise, I should say, in reading these poems as the depiction of a psychological state, then maybe that shows that Marvell is well ahead of his time, because that's the kind of thing you get in the later 19th century with poems by Browning, for instance, in his dramatic monologues, or certainly in some 20th century poetry. Right, well then I want to move on to the mower against gardens. Here we have now a bridge between this and his very fine poem, The Garden, because the subject matter is gardens, but a bridge because here we have presumably the same speaker, the mower. And the mower doesn't much care for gardens, as the title indicates. This is a poem of about 40 lines, well, exactly 40 lines, in which the mower is, I wouldn't say exactly railing against gardens, but he's certainly talking them down. He's certainly explaining to the listener why he doesn't much care for gardens. And in a word, it's because they're too artificial. And then towards the end of the poem, he compares the garden with the fields in the countryside that he finds much more congenial, because there's no artificiality there. They contain the plants that come essentially from the hands of nature. Luxurious man, both over concerned with physical pleasures, but in particular the physical pleasure having to do with sex. So lecherous or luxurious man, to bring his vice in use, did after him the world seduce. So a man, when he applies his consciousness to the environment around him, can only be destructive. Man is a fallen creature, and therefore when he inserts himself into the world around him, he is going to cause the world to fall as well. Seduce, literally a Latin word, seducere, to lead astray. And but again, that notion of seduce with its sexual overtones as well. And from the fields, the flowers and plants allure, where nature was most plain and pure. So out there in the fields, where you have, let's say you're driving along and you see out in the wild, you see verbena, right? And you think, how nice it would be for me to take some of that verbena and transplant it in my garden. Not a good thing to do. Not only is that illegal, but it's not a good thing to do, because that verbena is supposed to be out there in the hand of nature. That's more natural. To take it into your garden is to force it into an artificial environment, an unnatural environment. He first enclosed within the garden square a dead and standing pool of air. So this notion that you construct a garden, perhaps you've got a brick wall around it, as often in the case of an old Renaissance garden, and within those confines what you have is a kind of stagnant air, nothing moving there, no spiritus or breath or wind. and a more luscious earth for them did need, which stupefied them while it fed. Yes, if you're a careful gardener, you know that perhaps the most, well, one of the three absolutely essential ingredients to success in growing water, sunshine, and proper watering, proper amount of sunshine, is soil preparation, right? You can make your garden infinitely fertile by preparing and over preparing the soil, and that will allow one to cultivate very delicate plants. But it also contributes to that very delicacy because it's unhealthy for plants to eat, to feed on soil that is that overly nutritious, that unnaturally fertile. In the same way that it's unhealthy for a human being to live on, I don't know, cheesecake and M&Ms, let's say. That's not all washed down with Coke. That's not going to be a good diet. It's going to eventually prove unhealthy. The pink grew then as double as his mind. So the pink is generally speaking, perhaps a carnation. And so it's not natural. And you see this in all kinds of different flowers where, and one has to be careful here if one is talking to students from Mississippi State University, an agricultural school. But the idea here that through genetic engineering, through manipulation of the breeding of plants, you can begin to get such odd and unnatural things as double-petaled plants and so on, and various kinds of hybrid colorings. That's unnatural, and there's something strange and sinister about that. And the pink grew then as double as his mind, and so there's a kind of moral reflection here, that if you're going to give double petals to these flowers in an unnatural way, it argues a kind of should we say, unsoundness of a moral unsoundness of mind, right? This sort of person that would do this is untrustworthy, morally speaking. And nutriment did change the kind, right? That you can. This is true, I believe. I believe this is true about, for instance, hydrangeas. One of the differences between the yellow hydrangeas and the pink may have to do with the acidity of the soil. The more acidic the soil is, the more blue the hydrangea is going to be, at least in certain varieties, so that you can, by changing the soil, and it's also true of fertilizers, right? If you want bigger root crops, then you get a fertilizer with a bigger middle number and that kind of thing, so that you can you can manipulate the plant by depending on what you feed it. Let's see. With strange perfumes he did the roses taint, and the flowers themselves were taught to paint. So you get these kind of hybrid, let's say hybrid tulips, where you get not just a solid colored petal, but you get, let's say, a white petal with red stripes now introduced in these Darwin hybrid tulips. That's unnatural. It shouldn't be the case. The tulip white did for complexion seek, and learned to interline its cheek. Its onion root they then so high did hold that one was for a meadow sold. So, and it is indeed the case that in the earlier 17th century there was a great mania for tulip bulbs from Holland, and in fact it produced a speculative bubble that ended up kind of like our real estate bubbles or our tech bubble of the 1990s. It produced the price of these bulbs these bulbs were sort of in an artificial way. An artificial demand was created for them, and so the price rose artificially high, and people began to speculate in them, as people will do with commodities, and then everything came crashing down and fortunes were lost and so on. All of this is weird and artificial and causes bad results. Its onion root they then so high did hold that one was for a meadow sold. Another world was searched through oceans new to find the marvel of Peru. So let's think of this as a kind of, let's say, exotic orchid, right, that people will pay enormous amounts of money for. I don't say that this particular plant was an orchid, but you understand the point there. And yet these rarities might be allowed to man, that sovereign thing and proud, had he not dealt between the bark and tree forbidden mixtures there to see. Maybe we could barely have tolerated this kind of genetic engineering that he's talked about so far, but human beings have just gone too far when they introduce grafting. Right, that you take an apple tree, and if you carefully graft the branch of a pear tree on it, apparently you can force an apple tree on some of its branches to grow apples and on others of its branches to grow pears. How weird and strange and unnatural is that? No plant now knew the stalk from which it came. He grafts upon the wild, and so now you get this mixture of different species. It's the kind, and he's at least trying to pretend that it produces in him the kind of revulsion that we might, I remember a few years ago when people were talking about cloning and so on, and we had Dolly the sheep who was cloned artificially. Then these questions arise: what happens if you genetically cross a human being with a monkey and this kind of thing? What kind of cross a human being with a who knows what other kind of animal and produce these various kind of chimeras? This is not a good thing. He plants upon the wild the tame that that uncertain and adulterate fruit might put the palate in dispute. His green seraglio has its eunuchs too, lest any tyrant him outdo. So you can begin to introduce these asexual forms of reproduction. A good example of this might be when I was a kid. You buy a watermelon, and part of the joy of the watermelon was what you do with all the seeds in your mouth. But in recent decades, in the last 20 or 30 years, there's been this rage for seedless watermelons. These are essentially watermelons that aren't going to be reproducing by means of seed. It's not the sort of thing that the speaker of this poem would look kindly upon. I might say, by the way, that you don't find this only here. You find an analog of this poem, the objections to artificial means of cultivation, particularly a kind of genetic engineering of plants. You find this as well in a speech by a character named Perdita in the second half of Shakespeare's play The Winter's Tale, one of the very last plays he wrote. And there's a very interesting passage in which Perdita talks about the fact that she's grown up in the countryside, and she's a perfect pastoral character, and she is objecting to the fact that some people use genetic engineering to change the nature of plants, and she uses arguments very similar to this. Let's see. And in the cherry, he does nature vex to procreate without a sex. 'Tis all in force. That's another. This is not natural. It's human beings using their ingenuity to force the plants into these strange and odd categories. 'Tis all in force, the fountain and the grot, while the sweet fields do lie forgot, where willing nature does to all dispense. So you bring these artificial features into your garden, like stands of rocks or pools of water and little waterfalls and so on. All of this is forced and unnatural and artificial. While the sweet fields do lie forgot. That's where nature is at its best, out there in the fields that are beyond the reach of the human intellect and will to dominate. Where willing nature does to all dispense a wild and fragrant innocence. Out there in the fields, there's a kind of innocence, and literally innocence, a Latin word which means lack of harm, a kind of innocence that is by its very nature. This is one of the problems here. You can contrast. It's all very well to contrast nature and the joys of nature with the post-lapsarian Garden of Eden, that is, the Garden of Eden after the fall. But this poem seems to indicate that by its very nature, gardens, almost by definition, gardens are bad things in contrast with nature. And fauns and fairies do the meadows till, more by their presence than their skill. So you do find these sentient creatures, creatures with some form of reason, fauns and fairies out there in the wilderness, but they don't use that intellect in order to carefully cultivate the ground. Their statues, polished by some ancient hand, may to adorn the garden stand. Yes, you can find statues of fairies and garden gnomes, let's say, and fauns and creatures from classical mythology placed in artificial gardens. But the speaker of the poem much prefers the real creatures out there in the wilderness. But howsoever the figures do excel, howsoever our artificial statues of these characters excel, the gods themselves with us do dwell. Out there in the countryside, we much prefer the real fauns and satyrs and fairies out there, not their artificial imitations in the form of statues in the garden. Once again, it's an interesting poem. It's very well done, of course, given the subject matter. The question is, what do we do with the subject matter? It's a bit odd to get that worked up about gardens. I mean, who is genuinely upset about gardens? It's one can understand the kind of anti-technological bent. We see this kind of thing in our own day, that there are people who are, against genetically modified foods and this kind of thing, who want to eat organic. That's understandable. But it does seem to me that it's not the only objection in this poem that gardens are cultivated by means of genetic modification, but that the garden itself, the very erection of a garden, as we find in the beginning of this poem, is in some way objectionable. Maybe it's objectionable because it will inevitably lead to these kind of unnatural practices of cultivation. Who knows? But again, it's within the confines of the poem. It's an interesting, very well done poem. The question, however, remains, is it a subject matter that deserves this kind of attention and this kind of, what should we say, I don't want to overstate the case, but almost moral outrage that is given voice in this poem? Seems very odd. And then what do you do with that poem if we compare it to Marvell's Garden, which is a reworking of his wonderful Latin poem in elegiac verse, if I recall correctly, called Hortus, which means garden or the garden. And here is a poem unequivocally in praise of gardens, and in fact, in praise, at the end of the poem, in praise of the artificiality of gardens, in contrast with sort of crude world of uncultivated nature. So very, very odd. I mean, we have two completely different points of view then in these two poems. Fortunately, it's not, at least as far as we know, it's not the same speaker, though it is the same poet, and that leads to some interesting questions. How vainly men themselves amaze to win the palm, the oak or bays, and in their incessant labor see, crowned from the single herb or tree, whose short and narrow verged shade does prudently their toil upbraid, while all the flowers and trees do close to weave the garlands of repose. So the first stanza of this poem, the point is that people work very, very hard, particularly in athletic contests, in order to be crowned with these laurel wreaths. But the laurel wreaths are grown in gardens, and gardens are the epitome of peace and repose. So how odd is it that people should strive very hard to be given something that is almost symbolic of peace and repose? Of course, one might argue that the athletic contest is an image of human life, and that one does strive hard and work hard in human life precisely to achieve that kind of repose, and that the very crown of laurel is an indication that now the competitor can rest on his laurels in the same way that we hope to in retirement. But at any rate, fair quiet have I found thee here, in innocence thy sister dear. So here in the garden we have innocence, whereas in the previous poem, innocence, the same thing, is found not in the garden, emphatically not in the garden, but in the countryside. Mistaken long I sought you then in busy companies of men. So he wants peace and innocence, quiet, I should say, and innocence. By the way, I might say that both quiet and innocence, particularly if you recall that quiet comes from the Latin word quies, which gives us also our word coy, that quiet and innocence are precisely the two things that the speaker of Coy Mistress objects to, because the object of his affections is too innocent and is too coy or quiet. Now he seems to prize quiet and innocence, and he's been looking for them in more populous places, in places where people go, but he finds that's not where you're going to, he discovers that's not where you're going to find them. You're going to find them in gardens. Your sacred plants, if here below, only among the plants will grow. So that is the results of innocence and quiet. Their plants, the results are found only here among plants, among gardens. Society is all but rude to this delicious solitude. No white nor red was ever seen so amorous as this lovely green. So the stock colors of the woman with a beautiful complexion, white and red, here is that's not nearly as attractive as the green that you're going to find here in the garden. Fond lovers, cruel as their flame, cut in these trees their mistress' name. Little, alas, they know or heed how far these beauties hers exceed. So your common, average, ordinary person is going to fall in love and carve his beloved's name in the bark of the tree. But that person is completely ignorant. If he knew better, he would see that the garden is far more beautiful than the woman herself. Fair trees, wheresoe'er your barks are I wound, no name shall but your own be. If I were to carve anything in the bark of these trees, it would be the names of the trees themselves, right? So the tree, and this is a hint towards the next to last stanza in this poem, that being in the garden is superior even to love. When we have run our passion's heat, thither let us make his best. Love hither makes his best retreat. So when you're disappointed in love, after all the fuss and fury of an affair in love or the pursuit of love, then you come and retire to the garden. And we learn this from the gods. If you go back and read Ovid's Metamorphoses, two famous occasions where two gods or demigods fell in love with human women and chased them, and these women were turned into plants. So it's almost as if the gods themselves were striving, were running to find solace in a garden. The gods that mortal beauty chase still in a tree did end their race. Apollo hunted Daphne so, only that she might laurel grow, and Pan did after Syrinx speed, not as a nymph, but for a reed. And then the next stanza we get the emphasis on the various fruits. What wondrous life in this I lead, ripe apples drop above my head. The luscious clusters of the vine upon my mouth do crush their wine. The nectarine and curious peach into my hands themselves do reach. This is imagery very similar to that of Bermudas, that the plants actually, the fruit actually put themselves in you. They intrude upon you, make it impossible for you not to eat them. So what does this mean? Is this an example of the kind of thing that we get in Ben Jonson's Two Penshurst, in which the land is so bountiful that the fish jump into your nets because they're eager to be consumed? That, I think, is little more than a trope that about the bounty of the land. Maybe this stanza in this poem is discussing the bounty of the garden, and yet there seems, as in the poem on the Bermudas, there seems a kind of reveling in the sensual description of the fruit that maybe hints at the Garden of Eden, particularly at the end of this stanza. Stumbling on melons as I pass, ensnared with flowers, I fall on grass. And this recalls, of course, the fall of the grass in the mower poems, but also perhaps hints at the fall in the garden, which brought sin into our world. Who can say? Meanwhile, the mind, and here we have a stanza that is just pretty astonishing in its implications. So far now he's been talking about, in the previous stanza he's been talking about the physical pleasures afforded by the garden, the cool shade, and in particular the fruit. Now he talks about the intellectual pleasure afforded by the garden. Meanwhile, the mind from pleasure less, that is from physical pleasures, withdraws into its happiness. So in the peace of the garden, that allows a kind of mental meditation. The mind, that ocean where each kind does straight its own resemblance find, yet it creates, transcending these far other worlds and other seas. A very forward-looking stanza. It's really unique, almost unique here. It's not until the Romantics, Wordsworth and Coleridge, in the late 1700s, essentially we'll say 1800, that give us this idea, not that was absolutely common from the ancient world up through the 18th century, that the mind is a mirror of the world around us. In perceiving the world around us, what the mind sees is what's really out there. But according to the Romantics, the mind half creates what it perceives. This is as I say, a bit forward-looking of Marvell to give us this proto-romantic idea that the mind half creates what it sees out there. Yet it creates, transcending these far other worlds and other seas, annihilating all that's made into a green thought, and a green shade. So, maybe he doesn't mean something as important as what the Romantics say, 150 years later after this poem, but maybe he's just simply saying that in a garden, the peace allows the mind to slip away from its surroundings and meditate on other things. Or maybe the end of that stanza is indeed significant and says that the mind doesn't just simply observe what's around it, but that the mind is an incredibly creative force, annihilating all that's made to a green thought and a green shade. And that rhythm there, especially as it centers around the notion of the word green, is the same kind of rhythm we get in line, 18 of Bermudas. Is that right? Yes, like golden lamps in a green night. Here at the fountain's sliding foot, or at some fruit tree's mossy root, casting the body's vest aside, my soul into the boughs does glide. So again, repeating the idea that the mind then leaves the body behind and the physical pleasures of the body behind, and in this piece then slips into the boughs and becomes almost bird-like. And there, like a bird, it sits and sings and whets and combs its silver wings. This looks forward a bit to William Butler Yeats's two magnificent Byzantium poems, Byzantium and Sailing to Byzantium, when it whets and combs its silver wings, until prepared for longer flight, waves in its plumes the various light. Yes, and so these are the pleasures the garden afforded. It affords peace and repose. It affords these physical pleasures of the fruit. It affords the intellectual pleasures of being able to meditate. And then he talks about how incredibly self-sufficient then the garden is. Such was that happy garden state while man there walked without a mate. So it would be wonderful to live in a garden all by yourself and not feel like Adam, that you need someone else to share it with. After a play so pure and sweet, what other help could yet be meet? Language comes straight from the King James Version of the Bible. The help, Adam wanted God to make him a help that was meet for him or appropriate for him. But 'twas beyond a mortal's share to wander solitary there. Two paradises 'twere in one, to live in paradise alone. To be alone with one's thoughts in this garden and alone with one's pleasures in this garden would be absolutely magnificent, says Marvell. A rather oddly self-referential, oddly hermetically enclosed attitude, which perhaps reflects the self-enclosed nature of the garden here. How well the skillful gardener drew of flowers and herbs this dial knew. So there's a kind of flower sundial that's in this garden, or maybe the entire garden is in this shape. But at any rate, that's an artificial arrangement of plants. Here in this poem, that is described as skill. In the Mower Against Gardens, it would have been something for the gardener to be upset about. Where from above the milder sun does through a fragrant zodiac run, and as it works the industrious bee computes its time as well as we. How could such sweet and wholesome hours be reckoned but in herbs and flowers? So the very passage of time itself and the escape from that passage of time in this garden is best calculated in these artificial arrangement of plants. So the close of this poem explicitly saying that the artificial arrangement of plants in a garden is the ideal of life, whereas in the Mower Against Gardens we have just the opposite, that the garden encloses a dead and standing pool of air, and the only thing that one finds in this garden are these artificial horrors compared with which the sort of natural fecundity of the open fields is much preferable. So it's very difficult to say what's going on in these poems. You can read any individual poem in isolation and understand it, really. But why gardens should get a person so worked up that he should lavish, two very fine poems, particularly The Garden itself is a very fine, a very good piece of work, but that he should lavish this kind of poetic attention on that subject matter is strange in and of itself. And then the fact that these two poems essentially take flatly contradictory views and rather passionately contradictory views of the same subject. Perhaps he's just creating an artificial character in the mower, who's to say? And while we're talking about the mower, then, what is this business about Juliana? What has she done? And has what she has done justified his very intense reaction to it? All of this, to me, indicates that Marvell is a particularly enigmatic poet. As I say, one can read any given poem of his and understand it, but when you begin to compare these poems and read them together, they're at some cases they're almost wildly inconsistent with one another, which then raises the question, what is it that Marvell is up to? That is a question to which I, as yet, do not have a good answer. But at any rate, I hope this will have been a fruitful introduction to these poems taken individually.